stood, I addressed him some trivial question. He answered me with sufficient politeness, but with a grudging attention which betrayed the hold which his own thoughts had upon him. He coughed while speaking, and his eye, which for a moment rested on mine, produced upon me an impression for which I was hardly prepared, great as was my prejudice against him. There was such an icy composure in it, the composure of an envenomed nature, conscious of its superiority to all surprise. As I lingered to study him more closely, the many dangerous qualities of the man became more and more apparent to me, and convinced that to proceed further without deep and careful thought would be to court failure where triumph would set me up for life, I gave up all present attempt at enlisting him in conversation, and went my way in an inquiring and serious mood. In fact, my position was a peculiar one, and the problem I had set for myself one of unusual difficulty. Only by means of some extraordinary device, such as is seldom resorted to by the police of this or any other nation, could I hope to arrive at the secret of this man's conduct, and triumph in a manner which to all appearance was beyond human penetration. But what device? I knew of none, nor through 2 days and nights of strenuous thought did I receive the least light on the subject. Indeed, my mind seemed to grow more and more confused, the more I urged it into action. I failed to get inspiration indoors or out, and feeling my health suffer from the constant irritation of my recurring disappointment, I resolved to take a day off and carry myself and my perplexities into the country. I did so. Governed by an impulse which I did not then understand, I went to a small town in New Jersey, and entered the first house on which I saw the sign, "Room to Let." The result was most fortunate. No sooner had I crossed the threshold of the neat and homely apartment thrown open to my use, than it recalled a room in which I had slept 2 years before, and in which I had read a little book I was only too glad to remember at this moment. Indeed, it seemed as if a veritable inspiration had come to me through this recollection, for though the tale to which I allude was a simple child's story written for moral purposes, it contained an idea which promised to be invaluable to me at this juncture. Indeed, by means of it, I believed myself to have solved the problem that was puzzling me, and relieved beyond expression, I paid for the night's lodging I had now determined to forego, and returned immediately to New York, having spent just 15 minutes in the town where I had received this happy inspiration. My first step on entering the city was to order a dozen steel coils made similar to the one which I still believed answerable for James Holmes's death. My next, to learn as far as possible all of John Graham's haunts and habits. At a week's end I had the springs, and knew almost as well as he did himself where he was likely to be found at all times of the day and night. I immediately acted upon this knowledge. Assuming a slight disguise, I repeated my former stroll through Printing House Square, looking into each doorway as I passed. John Graham was in one of them, staring in his old way at the passing crowd, but evidently seeing nothing but the images formed by his own disordered brain. A manuscript roll stuck out of his breast pocket, and from the way his nervous fingers fumbled with it, I began to understand the restless glitter of his eyes, which were as full of wretchedness as any eyes I have ever seen. Entering the doorway where he stood, I dropped at his feet one of the small steel coils with which I was provided. He did not see it. Stopping near him, I directed his attention to it by saying, "Pardon me, but did I not see something drop out of your hand?" He started, glanced at the seeming inoffensive toy at which I pointed, and altered so suddenly and so vividly that it became instantly apparent that the surprise I had planned for him was fully as keen and searching a one as I had anticipated. Recoiling sharply, he gave me a quick look, then glanced down again at his feet, as if half expecting to find the object vanished, which had startled him. But, perceiving it still lying there, he crushed it viciously with his heel, and uttering some incoherent words, dashed impetuously from the building. Confident that he would regret this hasty impulse and return, I withdrew a few steps and waited, and sure enough, in less than 5 minutes he came slinking back. Picking up the coil with more than one sly look about, he examined it closely. Suddenly he gave a sharp cry and went staggering out. Had he discovered that the seeming puzzle possessed the same invisible spring which had made the one handled by James Holmes so dangerous? Certain as to the place he would be found in next, I made a short cut to an obscure little saloon in Nassau Street, where I took up my stand in a spot convenient for seeing without being seen. In 10 minutes he was standing at the bar asking for a drink.
"Whiskey!"
he cried.
"Straight!"
It was given him, but as he set the empty glass down on the counter, he saw lying before him another of the steel springs, and was so confounded by the sight that the proprietor, who had put it there at my instigation, thrust out his hand toward him as if half afraid he would fall.
"Where did that thing come from?"
stammered John Graham, ignoring the other's gesture and pointing with a trembling hand at the seemingly insignificant bit of wire between them.
"Didn't it drop from your coat pocket?"
inquired the proprietor.
"It wasn't lying here before you came in."
With a horrible oath, the unhappy man turned and fled from the place. I lost sight of him after that for 3 hours. Then I suddenly came upon him again. He was walking uptown with a set purpose in his face that made him look more dangerous than ever. Of course I followed him, expecting him to turn towards 59th Street, but at the corner of Madison Avenue and 47th Street he changed his mind and dashed toward 3rd Avenue. At Park Avenue he faltered and again turned north, walking for several blocks as if the fiends were behind him. I began to think that he was but attempting to walk off his excitement, when at a sudden rushing sound in the cut beside us he stopped and trembled. An express train was shooting by. As it disappeared in the tunnel beyond, he looked about him with a blanched face and wandering eye. But his glance did not turn my way, or if it did, he failed to attach any meaning to my near presence. He began to move on again, and this time towards the bridge spanning the cut. I followed him very closely. In the center of it he paused and looked down at the track beneath him. Another train was approaching. As it came near he trembled from head to foot, and catching at the railing against which he leaned, was about to make a quick move forward, when a puff of smoke arose from below and sent him staggering backward, gasping with a terror I could hardly understand, till I saw that the smoke had taken the form of a spiral, and was sailing away before him in what to his disordered imagination must have looked like a gigantic image of the coil with which twice before on this day he had found himself confronted. It may have been chance, and it may have been providence, but whichever it was, it saved him. He could not face that semblance of his haunting thought, and turning away he cowered down on the neighboring curbstone, where he sat for several minutes with his head buried in his hands. When he rose again, he was his own daring and sinister self. Knowing that he was now too much master of his faculties to ignore me any longer, I walked quickly away and left him. I knew where he would be at 6 o'clock, and had already engaged a table at the same restaurant. It was 7, however, before he put in an appearance, and by this time he was looking more composed. There was a reckless air about him, however, which was perhaps only noticeable to me, for none of the habitués of this especial restaurant were entirely without it, wild eyes and unkempt hair being in the majority. I let him eat. The dinner he ordered was simple, and I had not the heart to interrupt his enjoyment of it. But when he had finished and came to pay, then I allowed the shock to come. Under the bill which the waiter laid at the side of his plate was the inevitable steel coil, and it produced even more than its usual effect. I own I felt sorry for him. He did not dash from the place, however, as he had from the liquor saloon. A spirit of resistance had seized him, and he demanded to know where this object of his fear had come from. No one could tell him, or would. Whereupon he began to rave, and would certainly have done himself or somebody else an injury if he had not been calmed by a man almost as wild-looking as himself. Paying his bill,